She was only meant to serve tables, not solve a billion-dollar crisis. But the code she typed in the shadows changed everything for him and for her future. Rain poured down on Chicago, slicking the streets with silver and muting the rush of traffic outside the Gilded Steer. Jameson Blackwood pulled the collar of his thrift store jacket higher, slipping through the heavy brass doors like a man hoping not to be noticed. Inside, the warmth of firelight and the low hum of conversation pressed against him. But he chose the shadowy table near the kitchen, the one reserved for walk-ins who didn't quite belong. It was perfect. From here, he could watch without being watched, measure without being measured. He was not here for the steak or the wine, though both were unrivaled. He was here for the test, the silent search for something money had never once been able to buy. Honesty, unpolished and unprompted. Yet as he settled in, eyes sweeping across the expanse of linen and glass, it was not a polished waiter or an ambitious manager who caught his attention, but a young woman huddled near the service station, tapping furiously on a battered laptop. The glow of code reflected against her tired eyes, and the unsteady rhythm of her keystrokes seemed louder than the clink of crystal. Jameson leaned back, studying her without meaning to. She was wearing the same uniform as the others, a plain black dress beneath a starched white apron. Yet something about her posture made her stand apart. While others floated between tables with rehearsed smiles, she sat in the corner on her short break, shoulders hunched, hair pulled back in a simple tie, pouring herself into the screen like it was the only thing tethering her to the world. The cursor blinked against lines of code he could barely recognize from a distance, its steady rhythm like a pulse, daring him to wonder. He had seen plenty of staff steal a moment to scroll through feeds or message friends, but code was different. Code was discipline, structure, creation, and maybe survival. He told himself not to stare, yet he could not help it. Something in the frantic precision of her fingers reminded him of nights long ago when he had been young, sketching blueprints by hand in his Ohio bedroom, hoping to build a life bigger than the town he came from. A waiter passed by his table, giving him a cursory glance, the kind reserved for those unlikely to tip well. Jameson let the slight wash over him. It was what he came here for, to feel invisible, to see who others truly were when they believed he did not matter. His disguise worked as it always did. But still his eyes drifted back to the girl and her flickering screen. She did not look up once, did not fidget, did not waste her precious few minutes of rest. She typed, erased, typed again, as if fixing a problem only she could see. The code was hers alone, the solution hers alone. And in that quiet fight, Jameson saw something rare. Integrity lived not just in grand gestures, but in small ones, in the way someone used their break to build instead of escape. The cursor blinked, steady and patient, a quiet heartbeat in the corner of the room. And though Jameson had come to test the honesty of a staff he did not trust, it was that young waitress with the cracked laptop who drew him in first. Jameson sat back in his chair, the thin fabric of his corduroy jacket brushing against the wobbly wood. The menu lay open before him, though he had already made his decision long before stepping through the brass doors. His ritual was always the same, an order designed not to satisfy his appetite, but to test the patience and integrity of those who served it. When the waitress returned, the one with the brown eyes that carried the weight of sleepless nights and the cracked laptop resting on the side counter, he looked up and spoke with deliberate calm. "I'll have the Emperor's cut," he said, his voice softened to fit the role of a man who barely belonged. "And the cheapest beer you have." Her name tag read, Lina, the letters scratched from wear, yet her posture was straight and her voice even. She didn't blink at the contrast between a $500 steak and a $5 beer, didn't show a flicker of doubt or disdain, only nodded with a professional grace. "Of course, sir. Medium rare?" she asked, her tone neither eager nor dismissive, just steady, like she had learned to treat every order as if it mattered equally. He studied her carefully, waiting for the judgment that never came. In his world, where people read meaning into cufflinks and watch brands, the pairing of extravagance with cheapness would have earned a raised brow or a smirk. Yet Lina's expression stayed calm, her eyes focused on the notepad in her hand, her voice carrying only the faint rasp of exhaustion. She moved away with unhurried efficiency, weaving between tables of executives and couples dressed in silk, her worn shoes nearly silent against the marble floor. Jameson sipped his water and watched her, noting how she carried herself differently from the others, without the forced shine of charm or the brittle edge of ambition. She simply worked. When the order hit the system, he noticed the subtle falter of the restaurant's polished machine. A faint error tone chimed from the POS terminal near the wine station, a frozen screen locking just as Lina tried to confirm his request. Jameson leaned back, his eyes narrowing. Technology in his empire rarely failed, and when it did, it often revealed far more than anyone intended. Another server might have sighed, cursed under their breath, or passed the problem upward to the manager with practiced helplessness. But Lina pressed her lips together, tapped a sequence on the worn keys, and rerouted the order through a backup menu he could just glimpse reflected in the glossy counter. She moved quickly, fingers flying with the certainty of someone who had faced worse breakdowns before, her face calm, though the room buzzed around her. The system hiccuped again, freezing mid-transaction as a couple at the bar waved impatiently. Lina turned, her voice polite, asking them for a moment, then shifted to another station without fuss, entering the orders again as if nothing had gone wrong. The flow of the room barely wavered. Plates kept moving, drinks kept pouring, guests remained unaware of the storm beneath the surface. From his corner, Jameson felt something stir, the faint thrill of seeing competence unscripted, the kind that could not be taught by training manuals. Lina's movements were not showy, not designed to impress, but they were exact and effective, like code running clean. She didn't flinch, didn't judge, just solved the problem and moved on. For a man who had built towers of glass and steel yet longed to see something unvarnished, it was more telling than any report he had read. He had ordered a meal as a test, but already the real answer was unfolding in the quiet precision of a young woman who refused to break under pressure. The sound was subtle at first, just the faint, impatient tap of a card against a machine that refused to respond. A guest near the bar frowned, tried again, and the terminal beeped in protest before freezing altogether. Seconds later, another machine on the far side of the dining room gave the same hollow error tone, followed by one at a nearby table. Jameson lifted his eyes from the condensation sliding down his glass and studied the rhythm. The failures weren't scattered. They were spreading in a steady line across the room, one terminal after another blinking out like lights in a corridor. It was too precise, too orderly, not the chaos of chance, but the hand of something deliberate. He leaned back in his chair, appearing unconcerned, but inside his mind clicked through the movements like a chessboard. The staff responded with the usual polish, murmuring apologies, suggesting cash, offering to hold the card until the system refreshed. To the average guest, it looked like a minor glitch, the sort of thing that happens in even the best restaurants. But Jameson's instincts screamed otherwise. He had spent decades watching small ripples grow into tidal waves, and this ripple was spreading faster than anyone in the dining room could see. He reached for his pocket with the casual motion of a man adjusting his jacket, drawing out the simple burner phone he always carried during these pilgrimages into anonymity. The screen lit up with a new message from Arthur Pendleton, his anchor in the storm. Company-wide payments degrading. Unknown cause. Jameson's eyes tightened. This wasn't just the gilded steer, this was the empire. He sat perfectly still, outwardly the image of a man sipping beer he couldn't quite afford, yet every detail sharpened in his focus. The pattern of failure, the order of collapse, the timing between each stutter. It wasn't random noise, it was an infection crawling through a system designed to be seamless. Guests whispered, annoyed but patient, their attention fixed on their meals and their companions. But Jameson knew the weight of what was happening. A single evening of failed payments across his holdings could mean millions lost. But worse than the numbers was the wound to trust. His brand sold certainty, the assurance that money bought smoothness and luxury. And now that promise was cracking in real time. Across the room he caught Lina's movements, sharper now, her brow furrowed as she tested another station, her hands steady but her eyes wary. She didn't panic, didn't fumble. She guided guests with soft words, keeping their tempers cool, while her fingers worked behind the counter rerouting orders. Jameson noted the detail, the way she balanced calm with action. Yet even her quiet skill couldn't mask the truth. The system itself was buckling, and the fault wasn't in the wires of one restaurant. It was bigger, darker, deeper. He set his glass down slowly, the condensation pooling on the wood, and slipped the phone back into his pocket. On the screen, Arthur's words burned like a warning bell. Unknown cause. Jameson's jaw tightened. He knew then this was no accident, no passing glitch. It was a move in a larger game, and somewhere in the lines of failing code and stuttering machines, someone was daring him to notice. Lina Park sat in the cramped break room with the same cracked laptop she had carried since her sophomore year of college, its keys shiny from years of stubborn use. The smell of stale coffee clung to the walls, the hum of the refrigerator masking the faint rattle in her chest whenever she breathed too deep. She was 24 and already felt older than she should, worn thin from nights spent running between shifts and days caring for the grandmother who had raised her. Her grandmother's lungs, once strong enough to sing hymns on Sundays, now wheezed through oxygen tubes that hissed softly in their apartment, each breath a reminder that time was not on their side. Rent came due every month, power bills piled like enemies, and the medicine cabinet at home swallowed more of her paycheck than food ever did. Dropping out of her computer science program had never been part of the plan, but tuition and hospitals demanded sacrifices, and dreams were always the first thing to be cut. Still, Lina could not stop building. Even in exhaustion, she found herself sketching little programs, scripts that no professor would grade and no company would pay for, but they kept her sharp and gave her a sense of control in a life where everything else teetered on the edge. One of those projects now sat running on her screen, a makeshift wrapper she had written in the stolen hours between shifts. It was small and inelegant, not something that would ever impress a recruiter, but it worked. When the card terminals froze, when the network hiccuped the way it had tonight, her program quietly cached the tokens and stored them safe until the connection returned. Then, like a careful bookkeeper, it reconciled every transaction, matching cents to cents, ensuring no tip was lost and no bill left unpaid. It was duct tape on a failing machine, but it was duct tape made with dignity. She had built it because she knew what it was like to watch a system fail, to see something essential break down, while those in charge pretended it was fine. She had lived too long in that kind of silence. Now, every time the terminal blinked and froze, she tapped her code into place, whispering prayers it would hold just long enough to get through another night. None of the other staff knew what she was doing. They only knew that somehow their tips kept showing up, their orders cleared, and their guests stayed calm. They thought she was just quick with her hands, but really it was the laptop on her break table, the long strings of letters and symbols that spoke more honestly than words ever could. Her grandmother always told her that every family needs one person willing to patch the holes in the roof, even if it means standing in the rain. Lina had taken that lesson to heart. Only her roof was digital, her rain made of collapsing systems and frozen terminals. She did not think of herself as brilliant or heroic, just necessary. And tonight, as the failures spread across the restaurant, as whispers of inconvenience began to ripple through the dining room, she pressed save on her little script, praying it would hold. For her, it was never about recognition. It was about survival. And if survival came disguised as code on a battered laptop, then so be it. The second message came with the same sharp vibration against his leg, a signal Jameson had learned to anticipate in nights like this. He slid the phone from his pocket, shielding the glow beneath the table. Arthur's words were clipped as always, stripped of excess, yet they carried the weight of a storm breaking. New firmware identified, pushed by Nextgate systems, sits at the center of the outage. Signed, trusted, spreading. Jameson stared at the message until the words blurred, his reflection wavering in the untouched water glass before him. His knuckles tightened around it, the cool surface damp with condensation, and for the first time that night, he felt the faint edge of fury. Nextgate. They were one of the vendors his company trusted most, their keys embedded across hundreds of systems, their reputation spotless, their contracts locked down with layers of legal precision. To the outside world, a signature from Nextgate meant security, but now that signature was the very weapon slicing through his empire. The chatter of the dining room seemed distant, muffled by the drum of his pulse. A man laughed loudly near the bar, a fork clattered against porcelain, but Jameson only heard the hum of betrayal. He knew how carefully Arthur verified every vendor, how many times they had sat together poring over risk reports, and yet even the tightest walls could be breached if the enemy had the right keys. The thought turned his stomach. A trusted update meant the infection would not be questioned. It would be welcomed, installed without hesitation, spreading like smoke through a house at midnight. He set the phone flat on the table and exhaled slowly, forcing control back into his body. Rage was useless now. Only clarity mattered. He looked toward Lina, who was moving quietly between tables, guiding guests with a composure that belied her exhaustion. She had no idea that the failure around her was not just a local glitch, but the echo of something systemic. Yet she treated every broken transaction as if it was hers to repair. There was a steadiness in her that contrasted sharply with the rot hiding behind Nextgate's signature. She had duct tape, they had keys, and somehow her solution felt more honest. Jameson's gaze returned to the screen of his phone, Arthur's message waiting like a verdict. Signed, trusted, spreading. He could almost hear Arthur's voice beneath the text, calm but edged with urgency, warning him that the breach was not random chaos, but a carefully planned move. Jameson tapped the phone dark and lifted the water glass again, his grip firm enough that the thin rim trembled. He thought of every hotel desk, every luxury lounge, every high-rise restaurant under his brand, each one now carrying the same poisoned firmware, each one silently compromised. It was a betrayal with the reach of an empire. He took a measured sip, the cold water bitter on his tongue, and set the glass down with care. Outwardly, he remained the quiet man at the worst table in the room, but inside the lines of battle were already being drawn. Nextgate had too many keys, and someone had turned them against him. The game had shifted, and Jameson Blackwood was no longer just a diner in disguise. He was a man staring at the fault line beneath his kingdom, ready to decide whether it would crack or whether he would hold it together with his own hands. Jameson rose slowly from his chair, carrying the empty beer glass with him as though he were simply stretching his legs. He drifted toward the service station where Lina stood, her laptop propped on the counter, its cracked hinge holding on by stubborn grace. She was typing again, fingers moving with the certainty of someone who had solved this problem before. The noise of the dining room swelled behind him, silverware against china and murmurs of mild annoyance at the failing terminals. But here near the hum of the espresso machine and the faint glow of her screen, the world felt smaller. He set the glass down gently on the counter, his presence quiet but deliberate. She looked up, eyes wary but not defensive, the kind of gaze held by someone used to interruptions yet unwilling to yield completely. "What are you running?" he asked, his voice low, the tone of a man curious rather than accusatory. Her fingers paused just long enough for her to process the question. Then she shrugged lightly, as though she had been asked about something unremarkable. "Just a little script," she said, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Habit more than anything. If something breaks, you fix it." 2 sentences, no decoration, no hint of pride, just the clean edge of fact. Jameson tilted his head, studying her with the same focus he gave to acquisition reports and stock projections. He had met hundreds of people who would have turned that moment into a performance, eager to explain, to boast, to inflate their own importance. But Lina didn't. She returned her gaze to the screen, tapped another key, and the frozen terminal beside them blinked back to life. A receipt spat out, the server nearby giving her a grateful nod before rushing off to deliver it. She accepted no thanks, demanded no recognition. She simply kept working, her attention fixed on the flow of code and commands, as though the recognition of others was an unnecessary distraction. "Who taught you to do that?" Jameson pressed, unable to let it go. Her answer came without pause. "No one," she said. "Just picked things up. College for a while, but mostly trial and error." Her voice was quiet, but her words carried the weight of long nights and silent persistence. She had not been trained by any polished mentor or guided by prestigious institutions. She had taught herself in the trenches of necessity. Jameson felt something shift in his chest, a faint stir of respect that ran deeper than admiration for talent. This was resilience disguised as modesty, substance without vanity. He leaned against the counter, pretending to study the machine while really watching her. The room continued its ballet of waiters and guests, but here at the edge of the service station, it felt like he had stumbled onto the core of something true. She typed another line, saved, then closed the laptop with a soft click, the cracked surface catching the dim light. She gave him a small, polite smile, the kind reserved for customers she did not know and might never see again, and reached for his glass. "I'll get you another if you'd like," she offered. He shook his head, his eyes steady on hers. "No, this was enough," he said, though he was no longer speaking of the beer. The ripple began softly, like a stone breaking the surface of still water, then widened with frightening speed. In New York, a Blackwood hotel front desk clerk apologized to a guest in a tailored suit as the card terminal refused to process his booking. In Los Angeles, a lounge manager scribbled room charges on paper slips, promising to reconcile later. In Miami, a charity gala linked to the Blackwood Foundation watched in confusion as pledged donations failed to clear, the digital applause screens frozen in silence. One location stumbling could be excused as chance, but dozens across the map stalling in the same hour painted a picture that Jameson did not need an analyst to explain. His phone buzzed against the wood of the table, Arthur's name lighting the screen. Jameson slid it open, bringing the device to his ear, listening to the steady voice of the only man who could cut through chaos with logic. "Pattern confirmed," Arthur said without preamble. "The outages line up across hotels, lounges, restaurants, and the Foundation. Every system tied to NextGate firmware is stuttering or dead. This isn't a glitch, Jameson. It looks like ransomware, possibly propagating through the POS supply chain." His tone was measured, calm, but Jameson could hear the undertone of urgency, the pressure of millions bleeding by the minute. Jameson's knuckles tightened against the edge of the table, the cheap jacket he wore unable to mask the authority in his voice. "How contained?" he asked. Arthur exhaled, a sound like paper shuffling. "Not contained. This is spreading through trusted updates. The very thing we built our efficiency on has become the weapon." Jameson's gaze drifted across the dining room, where guests still sipped wine and cut into steaks, without knowing the empire beneath their meals was cracking. He lowered his voice. "How long before they realize?" Arthur paused. "Hours at most." Social feeds are already catching stray complaints. By morning the press will connect the dots. Jameson shut his eyes for a brief moment, letting the weight of it settle, then opened them sharper, colder. "We can't wait for morning." On the line, Arthur's voice shifted. "I've already contacted her," he said. Jameson straightened, though his expression did not change. "Wren?" "Yes. She's in motion. You'll have her within the hour." The name was enough to ease a fraction of tension. Wren, the ghost who slipped between shadows, the one Arthur trusted when the polite avenues of corporate defense failed. She was the blade they kept sheathed until the enemy drew blood. The dining room clinked with oblivious laughter, but Jameson no longer heard it. He pictured front desks with handwritten ledgers, clerks apologizing, donations bouncing back with hollow error codes, loyal guests questioning the brand that promised perfection. He imagined investors' faces tightening when numbers failed to align, competitors circling with smiles that cut. But more than money, more than image, it was the violation of trust that struck deepest. His empire had been built on certainty, and tonight, certainty was crumbling. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, his mind already recalibrating. Across the city, Wren was wheeling into motion. Arthur was stitching together containment, and here at the Gilded Steer, a young woman with a cracked laptop had shown him a glimpse of resilience that no vendor key could counterfeit. The panic ripple was only beginning, but Jameson Blackwood was no stranger to storms. He would not drown. The hum of the dining room had taken on a strange undercurrent, a faint vibration of unease that most guests could not name, but all could feel. Terminals blinked with frozen screens, receipts half-printed, card taps rejected with hollow beeps. The other servers glanced toward the manager for guidance, their polished masks slipping into nervous smiles as they promised guests the issue would be fixed soon. Gregory Finch, ever the picture of oily charm, paced near the bar, whispering into his phone, clearly waiting for someone higher up to hand him a solution. But at the service station, Lina Park did not wait. She closed her laptop with a snap, walked straight to the network cabinet tucked behind the espresso machine, and without hesitation pulled the uplink cable free. The sudden click of disconnect was sharp, final, like cutting the cord of a bomb. A red light blinked once, then held steady. The room's network had gone dark, and in that darkness Lina moved quickly, flipping the restaurant's systems into offline safe mode. It was a buried function few staff even knew existed, a contingency designed for storms or outages, a way to keep transactions recorded locally until the network returned. To her it was instinct, a line she had read, tested, trusted. She typed into the old terminal, her reconciliation queue wrapping each order like a net, cashing every dollar and tip, marking every receipt for later upload. One by one, the frozen machines released their grip, returning to service as if nothing had happened. Guests blinked at their bills, paid, signed, and returned to their conversations, the tremor of panic barely brushing their awareness. Jameson watched from his corner, his beer glass untouched, his eyes locked on her movements. No one had told her to act. No manual had guided her. No manager had ordered her hand. This was not training. This was instinct, sharpened by necessity. He saw the precision of her actions, the way she carried both the urgency of survival and the calm of someone who could not afford to panic. Around her, staff exhaled in relief, thinking the glitch had resolved itself, never knowing the truth of who had pulled them back from collapse. Finch certainly did not see it, his attention still buried in his phone, sweat beading beneath the sharp lines of his suit. But Jameson saw, and he stored the moment like a note written in fire. He had spent years hiring consultants and contractors, men and women with degrees and pedigrees, each one armed with jargon and polished reports. Yet none of them would have moved the way Lina had. None would have trusted their own hands enough to sever the network and take control. Her cracked laptop, her small patch of code, her decision to act without permission, had kept the dining room from unraveling into chaos. It was duct tape against ransomware, but duct tape applied with clarity and courage. Guests laughed again, glasses clinked, and the ripple passed, hidden beneath the surface. To them, the evening was flawless, the service impeccable, the meal uninterrupted. Only Jameson knew how close the mask had come to slipping. Only he had seen the truth in the way one young woman in an apron had bridged the gap between collapse and calm. And as he watched her return to the floor with nothing more than a polite smile, he felt a rare certainty settle inside him, the recognition of character so unpolished and pure that no disguise could hide it. The restaurant had steadied after her quick intervention, the hum of conversation returning as though nothing had happened. Yet Lina's eyes stayed locked on the terminal screen behind the service station. The others went about their duties, relieved that the crisis seemed to have passed, but Lina saw the strange rhythm still pulsing beneath the surface. She leaned closer, scrolling through lines of system logs, her brows furrowing as she caught the shape of something too clean to be random. The connections weren't failing outright. They were stuttering at intervals, each pause precisely timed like a metronome ticking in the dark. She tapped a pen against the counter, her instincts sharpening, then began to sketch the pattern on the back of a receipt, her handwriting fast and angled. Jameson, watching from his corner, noticed the movement. He saw her draw small blocks and arrows, jotting numbers down with the precision of someone who thought in structure rather than chaos. She muttered under her breath, her eyes darting between the frozen screen and the paper. A guest walked by, glanced at her scribbles, and dismissed them as doodles. But Jameson knew better. He had lived long enough to recognize focus when he saw it, the kind that pulled truth out of static. Her pen traced intervals, then circled a string of letters she had written in all caps. DNS fallback, she had noted, underlined twice. It meant the system wasn't just breaking, it was looking for instructions elsewhere, beaconing to a place it trusted even when the network was down. She leaned back, chewing her lip, then began marking tiny breadcrumbs along the receipt, indicators of compromise she didn't even know she was naming. Hard-coded intervals, fallback domains, unusual ports. It was the language of a fight most servers never imagined, and she was mapping it in the margins of her shift. The paper, already smudged with grease from a tray she had carried earlier, now carried the outline of something bigger than this restaurant, something threaded through the very veins of the empire it belonged to. Jameson felt his pulse quicken, not from fear, but recognition. He had sat in boardrooms where experts with six-figure retainers and polished shoes had pointed to graphs and heat maps. Yet here was a waitress with cracked shoes and tired eyes drawing a map on a receipt with a borrowed pen. Her sketch was rough, imperfect, but it was real, a picture of the hidden hand pulling strings across his company. She had no idea how far her little notes might stretch. No idea that the breadcrumbs she marked tonight could lead through hotels, lounges, and offices across continents. She only knew what her instincts told her, that something was wrong and that she could not ignore it. He watched her fold the paper once, slipping it into her apron pocket as though it were nothing more than a spare order slip. But to Jameson, it was proof, a fragment of clarity in the fog of failure. Her napkin map might not look like much to the untrained eye, but scaled across the empire it could reveal the very pattern they needed to understand, the skeleton of the attack itself. And in that quiet act, Jameson saw not only courage but possibility, the kind of raw honesty that could change everything if he chose to trust it. The restaurant had steadied after her quick intervention, the hum of conversation returning as though nothing had happened. Yet Lina's eyes stayed locked on the terminal screen behind the service station. The others went about their duties, relieved that the crisis seemed to have passed, but Lina saw the strange rhythm still pulsing beneath the surface. She leaned closer, scrolling through lines of system logs, her brows furrowing as she caught the shape of something too clean to be random. The connections weren't failing outright, they were stuttering at intervals, each pause precisely timed, like a metronome ticking in the dark. She tapped a pen against the counter, her instincts sharpening, then began to sketch the pattern on the back of a receipt, her handwriting fast and angled. Jameson, watching from his corner, noticed the movement. He saw her draw small blocks and arrows, jotting numbers down with the precision of someone who thought in structure rather than chaos. She muttered under her breath, her eyes darting between the frozen screen and the paper. A guest walked by, glanced at her scribbles, and dismissed them as doodles. But Jameson knew better. He had lived long enough to recognize focus when he saw it, the kind that pulled truth out of static. Her pen traced intervals, then circled a string of letters she had written in all caps. DNS fallback, she had noted, underlined twice. It meant the system wasn't just breaking, it was looking for instructions elsewhere, beaconing to a place it trusted even when the network was down. She leaned back, chewing her lip, then began marking tiny breadcrumbs along the receipt, indicators of compromise she didn't even know she was naming. Hard-coded intervals, fallback domains, unusual ports. It was the language of a fight most servers never imagined, and she was mapping it in the margins of her shift. The paper, already smudged with grease from a tray she had carried earlier, now carried the outline of something bigger than this restaurant, something threaded through the very veins of the empire it belonged to. Jameson felt his pulse quicken, not from fear but recognition. He had sat in boardrooms where experts with six-figure retainers and polished shoes had pointed to graphs and heat maps. Yet here was a waitress with cracked shoes and tired eyes drawing a map on a receipt with a borrowed pen. Her sketch was rough, imperfect, but it was real, a picture of the hidden hand pulling strings across his company. She had no idea how far her little notes might stretch. No idea that the breadcrumbs she marked tonight could lead through hotels, lounges, and offices across continents. She only knew what her instincts told her, that something was wrong, and that she could not ignore it. He watched her fold the paper once, slipping it into her apron pocket as though it were nothing more than a spare order slip. But to Jameson, it was proof, a fragment of clarity in the fog of failure. Her napkin map might not look like much to the untrained eye, but scaled across the empire it could reveal the very pattern they needed to understand, the skeleton of the attack itself. And in that quiet act, Jameson saw not only courage, but possibility. The kind of raw honesty that could change everything if he chose to trust it. Jameson waited until the dining room began to thin. The clatter of cutlery replaced by the softer scrape of chairs and the muted murmur of departing guests. Lina stood at the service station, wiping down a counter that had already been cleaned, her movements deliberate, the kind of ritual performed when the body was too tired to rest. He rose from his seat, adjusting the frayed cuff of his jacket, and crossed the room with the slow steps of a man unsure of his welcome. She glanced up as he approached, her guarded expression flickering into polite neutrality, the look of a waitress prepared to field another request before she could clock out. He kept his tone low, casual, though each word was chosen with care. "You ever see what you found tonight? Anywhere else?" She studied him for a beat, then shook her head slightly, cautious, unwilling to say more. He leaned in just enough, his voice softer still. "I've got a friend who runs a kind of war room for problems like this. I think you'd be useful there." Her eyes widened, suspicion mingling with exhaustion. "I don't even know you," she said, and her words held the plain truth of someone who had been forced to weigh trust like currency. "And I've got a double shift tomorrow. Plus..." She hesitated, her voice faltering as if admitting the next part cost her pride. "I need to pick up medication tonight. My grandmother's. I can't afford to miss it." Jameson nodded slowly, as though she had simply confirmed what he already knew. He could see the calculation in her eyes, the walls she had built to protect what little stability she had. No safety net, no backup plan, every decision weighted by survival. He slipped his phone from his pocket, tilting it just enough to send a message without breaking her gaze. Across the city, Arthur Pendleton received it instantly, and within minutes responded with the efficiency Jameson had come to depend on. A driver was rerouted, pharmacy bags collected, prescriptions filled, the charge cleared by a company account that would never bounce. Arthur's final touch was the IOU, written not in vague promises, but in sharp ink across official letterhead, signed with a name that carried weight in every bank and court. It was the kind of note that actually meant something, the opposite of the empty words Lina had no doubt heard too often. Jameson slipped the folded paper from his pocket and placed it gently on the counter between them. "For your grandmother," he said. She stared at it, then back at him, her breath catching as she recognized the seal. For the first time all night, her composure cracked, the walls bending under the weight of unexpected help. She swallowed hard, blinking fast, her voice unsteady. "Why?" He gave the faintest of smiles, one without triumph or pity, only quiet conviction. "Because you fixed something no one else even saw. And because people who act like that deserve a chance to do more than just survive." The ballroom smelled of burnt coffee and adrenaline, its chandeliers dimmed, its carpet crowded with cables and open laptops. Round tables once used for banquets were cluttered with monitors, engineers hunched in shirt sleeves staring at graphs that pulsed in angry red. Every screen told the same story, transactions failing in waves, systems faltering under the weight of poisoned code. The air carried the murmur of technical jargon, sharp instructions, and the rustle of paper cups passed between trembling hands. This was not a place for fine dining or speeches. It was command central for a war no guest would ever see. Jameson moved through it with silent authority, his jacket still thrift store but his posture unmistakably that of a man who owned the walls around them. He gestured Lina toward a spare station near the back, a folding chair and an idle terminal waiting. She hesitated only a second before sitting, her cracked laptop balanced on her knees, her eyes scanning the room with quiet caution. She did not rush to speak, did not push herself forward as the others argued about propagation vectors and vendor liability. Instead, she listened, her fingers moving lightly across the keys, testing, probing, watching logs spill like confessions. She leaned closer to the screen, brow furrowing, her focus narrowing as though the chaos around her had faded into background noise. Jameson watched from across the room, noting the difference between her and the engineers with lanyards and degrees, their words slick, their confidence polished. She had no stage presence, no need to impress, only a sharp mind and the discipline to hear before speaking. When she finally did raise her voice, it was quiet, almost hesitant, but it cut through the noise with the clarity of truth. "It's beaconing out," she said. A few heads turned, uncertain whether to listen, but she continued, her tone steady. "Intervals are fixed, fallback is hard-coded. You can trace it, but if you want to stop it, you need to pull it under. Sinkhole the domains, redirect them, trap the beacons." Her hand tapped the side of her laptop, as though it could illustrate what her words left unsaid. A silence settled briefly before one of the engineers frowned. "That only stalls it. We still need integrity verification." Lina nodded once, already anticipating the challenge. "Signed binary checks. Force the terminals to validate against a clean chain. Anything else? Drop it." Her pen scratched across a spare receipt she had pulled from her apron pocket, diagramming a blunt rollback routine. "And this," she added, "a script simple enough not to brick the older models when they roll back." The room went still for a moment, her plain words heavier than the jargon flying minutes before. Someone muttered that it was crude, another whispered it was risky. But already others were leaning closer, their eyes narrowing as they realized blunt might be exactly what the moment required. Jameson caught Arthur's glance from across the room, the smallest nod passing between them. Fear and caffeine drove the war room, but in the middle of it, one waitress in an apron had laid out the path forward, not with polish or bravado, but with substance no one else had dared to offer. The numbers on the screens were relentless, each graph bleeding red as transactions failed across time zones. Every hour that passed meant millions lost, not just in revenue but in something far more fragile, the trust that had taken years to build. Social feeds began to flare with frustration, guests posting pictures of frozen terminals, donors complaining that their pledges to the Blackwood Foundation bounced back with hollow error codes. On the East Coast, a hospital partner called in a panic, their system unable to process co-pays for critical procedures. In another corner of the world, a relief flight bound for South America sat grounded, its catering invoice trapped in limbo. The weight of it pressed down on the room until every engineer's shoulders sagged under the burden. The ballroom buzzed with frantic voices, keyboards clicking like weapons in a battle they weren't sure they could win. In the middle of it, Jameson stood, his thrift store jacket at odds with the authority he radiated. He listened, not interrupting, letting them spill their fears and argue over theories, then raised one hand. The room stilled, not out of fear but because his presence demanded it. When he spoke, his voice was low, even, every syllable deliberate. "Look at me," he said. Eyes lifted from screens, restless hands froze. The air itself seemed to pause. "This isn't the end of us. It's a problem. Problems are solved. And until it is solved, I am the only one you answer to. You need one throat to choke if this fails, and it's mine. No one else takes the blame." The effect was immediate. The frantic edge softened, not because the crisis was smaller, but because someone had claimed it, carried it, made it safe for them to focus. Arthur stood nearby, his presence calm as always, but even he tilted his head with the faintest hint of approval. Lina, still at her station with her cracked laptop open, glanced up at Jameson. For a brief second her guard dropped, and she allowed herself to believe he might actually mean it. Then she bent back to her screen, typing with sharper focus, her script evolving under her hands. The clock ticked loud in the ballroom, each passing minute a reminder of the millions slipping away, each second an echo of trust being chipped at by unseen voices online. Yet within the chaos there was a center, a man who refused to waver. Jameson walked the perimeter slowly, stopping behind engineers, asking short questions, nodding at their answers, never raising his tone. When someone stumbled, he steadied them with a quiet word. When another doubted, he met their eyes until the doubt drained away. He was not a technician, not a coder, but his authority was the backbone they needed. Outside the ballroom, the world still faltered, but inside it, a fragile order held. Every hand moved with renewed discipline, every mind bent harder against the problem. And though the clock continued its merciless rhythm, each tick seemed just a little less heavy, because Jameson Blackwood had given them what only a true leader could calm in the storm: authority without noise, and the certainty that if everything collapsed, it would be his shoulders, not theirs, that bore the fall. The ballroom lights buzzed faintly above them, the air thick with the smell of coffee grounds and overworked circuits. Screens flickered with half-stable connections, engineers hunched in clusters debating architecture. But Lina sat apart at her station, her cracked laptop balanced on the edge of a folding chair. She typed with steady fingers, every line of code shaped by necessity rather than elegance. She was not building something to win awards or impress recruiters. She was building something that could survive the storm. She called it nothing at first, just a utility, lean and spare, but later one of the engineers watching her work muttered the word steer guard, and it stuck. The code was blunt but precise, each feature small enough to travel across shaky links, yet sharp enough to carve out a defense. Hash lists to check integrity, cert pinning to block forged signatures, process quarantine to hold infected routines in a cage rather than let them spread. Most important of all, a journaled rollback routine designed not to destroy older terminals with fragile architecture, but to step them back safely, one command at a time. It was a patchwork shield, duct tape given form, but it was crafted with care and a sense of the human lives behind the terminals, the waiters and clerks who would be the first to feel the collapse. Arthur moved quietly behind her, his sharp eyes reading the documentation she produced alongside the code. He bundled her instructions into playbooks, crisp and clear, written in language managers could actually follow. He knew from long experience that technical brilliance meant nothing if those on the ground froze under jargon. Each playbook was a lifeline, guiding teams through the steps of deployment, the kind of clarity that kept chaos from blooming. He did not waste words. He did not let pride bleed into the documents. He made them practical, usable, immediate. Wren, leaning against a column with the posture of someone who saw every angle of the room, drafted a different kind of survival kit. Her field SOP read more like orders to a covert unit than hospitality guidelines. She wrote for managers who still thought firmware was a kind of suit fabric, breaking tasks into action so simple they could be followed under stress. Power down, reset, verify, log. Her words carried no patience for excuses, only the expectation of obedience in the face of crisis. Where Arthur smoothed the path, Wren cut it into stone. Together the pieces formed something larger than any one of them. Lina's code small enough to fit through the cracks, Arthur's playbooks shaping order from panic, Wren's SOP turning confusion into discipline. Around them the engineers shifted, their arguments quieting as they realized the solution was not going to come from polished frameworks or corporate manuals, but from a waitress with a broken laptop, a COO who still believed in clarity, and a former spy who trusted precision over theory. Jameson stood at the center, watching as the fragments of his strange team assembled into a weapon. Steerguard was not elegant, but it was alive, and it was theirs. Wren worked with the same calm focus she had carried through a dozen darker nights, her short hair tucked behind her ears, her eyes fixed on the scrolling evidence streaming across her terminal. While the engineers pored over logs and argued about propagation, she followed the quieter trail, the one that rarely announced itself, but always revealed the truth. She dug past the noise, past the failed transactions and corrupted updates, and into the signature at the heart of the poison. The stolen cert was there, bold as brass, signed by Nextgate and trusted by every system it touched. But it did not belong to Nextgate's public servers, not exactly. It had been lifted from a contractor, a smaller firm buried deep in the vendor's structure, a man who had been given too much access and not enough oversight. She pulled the man's file, piecing his story together, as though she had known him all her life. A contractor living in the suburbs, 3 kids, a mortgage, debts that had mounted quietly over years of missed chances, medical bills piled against his name, credit cards maxed, the kind of silent desperation that predators smelled from miles away. Black Moth had found him, the faceless syndicate that had been circling networks like vultures for a decade. They offered him money, a way to breathe, and all they asked in return was access. He had delivered it, not fully understanding what he had given away, only that his debts would loosen for a little while. Wren read the audit trail like a confession, her expression unmoved, though her jaw tightened with every line. The cert became the perfect skeleton key, signed and trusted, accepted without question across hundreds of systems. With it, Black Moth walked through the front doors of trusted networks as though they owned them. They did not need to sneak or break or force. They simply presented themselves as legitimate and were welcomed in. The infection that now rattled Jameson's empire had begun with one man's desperation and one group's ruthless precision. Evidence piled in Wren's logs like plates after a dinner rush, each one clattering into place, forming a stack too high to ignore. Arthur leaned over her shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he read the fragments. "Chain of custody is clean," he murmured, the rare edge of anger in his voice. "This isn't rumor." "It's proof," Wren nodded once, her fingers still moving, tracing connections from the stolen cert to the servers it touched, mapping the spread like a disease model. "Black Moth rides clean certs," she said flatly. "They always have. By the time anyone questions it, they've already built nests too deep to burn out." She turned the screen toward Jameson, her eyes hard. "This isn't just an accident. It's an inside leak. Your empire trusted the wrong man, and that man sold his keys." Jameson stood silent, his hands folded behind his back, his face unreadable. But inside him the truth settled like iron. His company had been poisoned not by outsiders breaking in, but by trust extended to the wrong hands. And now that trust had to be rebuilt, one decision at a time, starting with this night. Midnight came like a held breath, the moment when decisions turned into action and hesitation became ruin. Across 15 time zones, managers who only hours before thought firmware was a fashion term now clutched playbooks written in Arthur's crisp hand and Wren's clipped instructions. Their screens glowed pale in dark offices, their voices tense on headsets as they prepared to run a dance of survival. The steps were simple on paper, but heavy in consequence. First, the sinkhole, redirecting the poisoned beacons into silence, trapping the chatter before it could spread further. Then the verify, each binary checked against a clean chain, hashes aligned like soldiers in rank. Finally, the rollback, Lina's blunt script guiding the old terminals backward without bricking them, easing them into stability with the patience of someone who understood fragile machines because she had lived with fragile lives. The dashboards in the ballroom displayed it all, rivers of data bleeding red, then slowly, cautiously, bleeding less. Jameson stood with his arms folded, his thrift jacket replaced now by the weight of his authority, watching as the tide began to turn. Engineers leaned forward in their chairs, breath caught, as amber lights bloomed across the map, signals of systems that had survived the cut and were stabilizing. One by one, the green returned, hesitant at first like seedlings through cracked soil, then stronger, wider, stretching across continents. The relief was palpable, but no one dared celebrate too soon, not while red still lingered in clusters, not while the clock still counted dollars lost with every passing second. At the gilded steer itself, where the night had begun, a single terminal blinked, its frozen screen clearing, a small chime breaking the silence of the service station. A server standing nearby gasped softly, pressing a hand to her chest as if she had been holding her breath all year and had only now remembered to exhale. She looked at Lina with something like gratitude, though she had no idea of the code written in exhaustion on a battered laptop. No idea of the duct tape solution that had been scaled to an empire. She only knew that the machine worked again, that her shift could end without the terror of tips lost and guests furious. Lina barely looked up from her screen, her dark hair falling forward as her fingers continued to move, confirming logs, double-checking the journaled rollbacks, ensuring nothing slipped through. Her utility was holding, her crude lines of code working like scaffolding against a collapsing wall. Jameson watched her, his eyes steady, knowing the empire had been steadied not by polished suits or vendor guarantees, but by the quiet courage of someone who had refused to let things break without trying to fix them. The dashboards shifted again, more green lighting up, amber fading, red shrinking into the margins. The crisis was not over, not yet, but the balance had changed. Midnight had passed, and with it, the tide. What had begun as failure was turning, slowly and surely, into survival. The conference room at Nextgate's headquarters was all glass and steel, the kind of place designed to project power through silence. Jameson entered with Arthur at his side, their footsteps muffled against the carpet, their expressions controlled, carrying none of the storm that had kept the Empire awake for nights. Across the polished table sat Nextgate's executives, men and women in tailored suits, their smiles brittle, their hands folded too tightly. They expected anger, shouting, threats, the theater of a billionaire trying to prove his weight. Instead, Jameson sat, set a folder on the table, and opened it with deliberate calm. Inside were the logs, the timelines, the receipts of betrayal written in clean lines of code and server stamps. Arthur slid them forward, each page marked, each event traced, a chain of custody that left no room for excuses. He spoke in the same tone he used in boardrooms, steady and measured, as though he were explaining quarterly results. "These are your updates," he said, "signed by your keys, deployed across our systems. This is the contractor you trusted, the one squeezed by debt. This is the cert he handed over, the door Black Moth walked through. And these are the systems that fell because of it." His words were precise, his hand never trembling as he turned each page, stacking the evidence until it felt heavier than any threat could. The executives shifted, one clearing his throat, another beginning to protest, but Jameson lifted a hand and the room quieted. He did not raise his voice, did not lean forward. He simply looked at them with the cold certainty of a man who had already decided what came next. "I don't need apologies," he said softly. "I don't need promises that it won't happen again. What I need is accountability, and what you need is to understand that this is no longer your choice." His words hung in the air like iron, sharp and immovable. The door opened then, and Wren stepped in, her dark eyes sweeping the room with practiced disinterest. In her hand was a slim, encrypted drive, the culmination of the work she had pieced together from nights of chasing shadows. She crossed the room without pause, passed the drive to 2 federal agents waiting in the hall, then returned to lean against the wall. The gesture was small, almost casual, but its meaning was absolute. The evidence no longer belonged to Blackwood Holdings alone. It was now in the hands of the law. Subpoenas would follow, charges would mount, and the theater of power Nextgate had built around themselves would collapse under the weight of its own corruption. Jameson closed the folder, his movements precise, his eyes never leaving the executives. "You will answer to them now," he said, nodding toward the hallway where the agents waited. "And you will rebuild what you broke under their watch, not mine." He rose, Arthur standing with him, and for a moment the silence in the room was suffocating. No shouting, no theater, only facts laid bare and consequences already set in motion. Jameson turned, walked out with Arthur and Wren at his side, leaving the weight of truth behind them, heavier than any voice raised in anger could ever be. Morning light slanted through the tall windows of the gilded steer, catching the gleam of silverware and the polished shine of marble floors. The restaurant was quieter than usual, the rush of guests not yet begun, but the staff had been summoned early, their eyes curious and cautious as they gathered near table 32. Jameson stood there, no longer in the thrift store jacket that had hidden him, but in a suit of dark charcoal that fit like a second skin. He did not look like the tired man who had ordered beer and the Emperor's cut. He looked like the owner, the man whose name carried the weight of towers and contracts, a figure both familiar and distant. Arthur stood behind him, calm as always, and Wren lingered in the background, her presence a shadow sharp with certainty. The staff whispered among themselves, stealing glances at Lina, who shifted nervously near the service station, her apron still tied, her cracked laptop hidden in her bag. Jameson raised a hand, and the murmurs died. His voice carried easily across the room, steady, measured, but warm enough to hold every ear. "Last night," he said, "this restaurant faced a crisis none of you could see, but one of you did not look away. While others waited for instructions, she acted. While systems failed, she built. And while fear could have kept her silent, she chose courage." His eyes turned to Lina, and for a moment she froze, feeling every gaze swing toward her, the heat of attention pressing against her chest. He stepped closer, his words directed now at her, though still for everyone to hear. Lina Park kept this place standing when it could have fallen. She saw the truth in failing machines, and found a way to keep them alive. She did not do it for praise, she did not do it for recognition, she did it because it needed to be done. That is what character looks like. The silence that followed was thick, the staff staring at her with wide eyes, some with disbelief, others with quiet admiration. Jameson reached into his jacket and placed a folded document on the table, the seal at the top unmistakable. "Your grandmother's medical debt is gone," he said simply. Lina's breath caught, her hand flying to her mouth as if to keep the sound inside. Her knees trembled, and for a moment she thought she might fall, but Jameson continued gently. "And more than that, you deserve the chance to finish what you began. Blackwood Holdings will fund your full scholarship to complete your degree. No conditions, no strings." She shook her head slightly, tears gathering in her eyes, her voice a whisper. "I don't know what to say." Jameson smiled faintly, the kind of smile that broke through steel. "Say yes. Because I am also offering you a role. Head of Rapid Response Engineering. You will lead a new division designed to prevent what happened last night from ever happening again. You will have resources, authority, and the freedom to build. But only if you say yes. Her hands shook as she reached for the paper, both hands gripping it as though it might vanish if she loosened her hold. She nodded, her voice trembling but clear. "Yes," she said, the word cracking through the silence. "Yes." Weeks later, the empire moved with a rhythm that felt renewed, not faster but steadier, the difference between a house patched with tape and a foundation rebuilt with care. Systems were no longer left to trust alone. Budgets once trimmed in the name of efficiency were restored to security, and audits no longer came dressed as ceremonies, but as sudden drills that demanded readiness. Staff learned to expect the unexpected, to carry dignity not only in how they greeted guests, but in how they safeguarded the unseen code that carried every bill, every booking, every donation. The words dignity first had become something more than a slogan. They had become a discipline, a way of working that stretched from the kitchens to the servers buried in glass towers. For Lina, the transformation had been just as profound. She had spent the weeks between two lives, one still tied to the gilded steer where her shoes knew every step of the floor, and one unfolding in the war rooms and offices where engineers spoke a language she had once only guessed at. She absorbed it quickly, not with the arrogance of someone who believed they had mastered it, but with the humility of a survivor who knew each lesson was a chance to stand taller. She still worked shifts, partly because she wanted to honor the staff who had once stood beside her, partly because leaving too suddenly felt like abandoning a chapter she had lived too deeply. Her grandmother's medicine arrived on time now, the cabinets no longer bare, the bills no longer suffocating. The apartment carried a little more air, a little more peace, though Lina still kept the cracked laptop on her desk, a reminder of the nights she had written her own safety nets when no one else would. It was not replaced, only retired, its hinge broken, but its history intact. She moved forward, carrying it as a relic of the moment when courage met necessity and carved out a future. On her last night in uniform, she tied her apron with the same careful knot, worked her tables with the same patience, and smiled with the same sincerity. Nothing about her manner suggested she was about to leave forever, but when the last plates were cleared and the last glasses dried, she walked to the back station, untied the apron, and placed it on the hook by the door. She touched the fabric briefly, feeling the weight of hours and years stitched into its folds, then let it go. In her other hand, she carried something new, a badge engraved with her name and a title that still felt unreal, Head of Rapid Response Engineering. Jameson stood near the entrance, watching without a word. He saw the small tremor in her hands, the mixture of fear and pride, the gravity of someone stepping into a life they had once thought impossible. He thought of the cursor she had stared at on a cracked screen, blinking patiently as she fought to keep systems alive. Now he saw that same steady blink not as desperation, but as promise. The beginning of a new chapter written with code, courage, and continuity. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.